You may know this story, but in 1948, the Communist Party of Romania, which was then part of the Soviet Union, organized a large gathering of Christian religious leaders. And evidently there was over 4,000 pastors and priests assembled. And what the Communist Party wanted to do was they wanted to kind of rein in the people of faith in Romania and bring all these different church groups together under the control of the Communist Party, under the control of the state. And it seemed at this assembly that it was working as one after another men came to the podium and basically said that communism and Christianity were fundamentally the same. They were all one. They were happy to be organized under the power of the state. And amazingly, they even proposed to make Joseph Stalin the president, the honorary president of this assembly, this new grouping. But in that gathering were a young married couple called Richard and Sabina Wurmbrand. And they were not happy with what was going on. It was a terrible compromise and a betrayal of the truth. And eventually Sabina Wurmbrand could bear it no longer, and she turns to her husband and says, "They are spitting in the face of Jesus. You must speak up. Go and wash the shame off of his face." And he hesitates, and then he turns to his wife and says, "You know, if I speak up against the communists here, you may no longer have a husband." To which she replies, "I don't want a coward for a husband." So Richard Wurmbrand begins slowly walking towards the microphone. He is somebody who's fairly well known, and he's welcomed onto the stage. And everybody believes that he's going to kind of go along with the mood of the assembly for the sake of peace. But of course he didn't. A lone voice amid so many, he spoke out of loyalty not to the communists, but of loyalty to Christ. And what he did that day came at great cost. The title of his biography, Tortured for Christ, tells us all we need to know. Now, at the end of our Bible reading this morning, we learn about people who, a bit like Richard and Sabina Wurmbrand, took a brave public stand for Jesus. Firstly, there's these women who had followed Jesus from Galilee. You might have noticed at the end there, verse 49 and following, whereas everybody else seems to be kind of walking away from the cross, it's all over and done with now, they're waiting. They're standing there. They want to see what's going to happen to the body of Jesus. And then when they know what's happened to it, they go away and prepare spices. They're standing out as different from those around them. But more prominently, there's this man, Joseph of Arimathea. And I think we need to understand that what that man did was very, very risky. He was a man of standing. He was a man of wealth. He had access to the Roman governor Pilate. He was a member of the Jewish council at that time. He had, in other words, a lot to lose. And I think we can imagine that his natural instinct would have been to do nothing, say nothing, just carry on enjoying his comfortable, quiet life. But here he is, choosing to publicly associate himself with Jesus. And here's this man, he's associating himself. Think about it. This is the man that his fellow Jews have just handed over to the Romans, have just deserted him so that he might be given a death which was reserved for the very worst. And here he is associating himself with that man. And he does it very publicly. He acts in broad daylight. He's acting sometime between 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the afternoon. It's in full public view. And what does he do? He goes and he takes the bloodied, emaciated body of Jesus from the cross and treats it as if it was a member of his family, a treasured member of his family, wrapping it in a linen cloth, placing it in a fresh tomb cut in the rock. This man from Arimathea, these women from Galilee, choose to stand up for Jesus when so many at the time are simply turning away from him. So the question this morning I think we have is why? What caused them to act in that way? And how might we be helped even this morning to follow their example? What caused them to act like that? What might help us to follow their example? Now, I realise it's very unlikely that we'll ever be required to do something so public as they did, or so public as what Richard and Sabina Wurmbrandt did. But there will be times in our lives, day by day, when we, as it were, have an opportunity to stand up for Jesus and honour him, when the majority of those around us are ignoring him and rejecting him. I think, even pointing to Jesus at Easter, when many simply ignore the origins of Easter, may require some bravery in your workplace, in your family, in your neighbourhood. What might help us here? What might help us stand up for Jesus, to honour him when so few others do? Well, perhaps it was simply the reminder of what they themselves knew about Jesus. Perhaps it was simply what they had seen of him, what they knew he had done, how he had reacted to everything done to him. Maybe that was what put steel in their bones. In other words, the very things that we're reading about this morning, that Luke has recorded about the Lord Jesus at that time, maybe that's what it was that put steel into their bones and might even have the same effect on us. Now, whenever I think about, kind of the need for confidence and to avoid cowardice, I realise how relevant this is to myself. My dad was quite an astute guy, and he once said, with Martin, it's anything for a quiet life. And in many ways, he was right. I'm the kind of person who doesn't like conflict. I don't like rocking the boat. I like to be liked. And therefore, that makes me somebody who's a bit timid on occasions. I don't necessarily want to speak up when I know I should. I don't want to ruffle feathers. In fact, I can be a bit of a coward. So I need to know what put steel in their bones so that it might put steel in my bones this morning. So I think we have real help here. And the title this morning is simply this. Let's put it up on the screen, guys. It's a cause for bold confidence. From this passage, we have, as it were, a cause for bold confidence. Now, Megan read the passage very well, but I'm going to read it again. And as I do so, I just wonder whether you might note how, in the midst of all the horror, how Jesus stands out as so special, so worthy, so wonderful, worthy of our devotion, worthy of our loyalty, worthy of our attention, so that we might, like these brave people, stand up for him even when others turn away. So let me read again, and maybe we'll just have that in our minds as I do so. So verse 26 of chapter 23, why not have that open as I read? As they led Jesus away, they seized Simon from Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country, and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned and said to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren women, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if men do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified him along with the criminals, one on his right, one on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others, let him save himself if he is the Christ of God, the chosen one." The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, "If you're the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was a written notice above him which read, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God," he said, "since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus answered him, "I tell you the truth, today you will be with me in paradise." It was now about the 6th hour, and darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour, for the sun stopped shining, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." When he said this, he breathed his last. The centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, "Surely this man was a righteous man." When all the people who had gathered to witness this saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away. Well, I think Dr. Luke's cure for cowardice and his cause for bold confidence might be here in 3 parts. And I think, firstly, it's the way in which he focuses on the facts of the crucifixion. And you notice he starts with this man, Simon of Cyrene. And it seems as if this guy has no idea what's going on. He's somebody who's coming from the country into the town. He's not one of the followers of Jesus. He's not somebody who's outwardly opposed to Jesus. You might say Simon of Cyrene is the kind of unexpected, unbiased witness who just suddenly comes across the scene and suddenly gets drawn into the middle of it. But although he knew nothing about what was going on, he's there, front row of the action, walking right behind Jesus, carrying the very cross on which Jesus would be nailed, following him down the road, seeing everything that's being done, hearing everything that's being said. Now, it seems likely that as a result of his experience that day, Simon of Cyrene became part of the early church. One of the other gospel writers tells us the names of his sons, as if the whole family has now become familiar to people in the early church. And it's as if they're saying, look, guys, if you want to know the details, go and talk to him or his boys. They will tell you exactly what happened because Dad was a front row seat eyewitness. And what he saw that day was horrible. Crucifixion was horrible. It was a horrible way to die. In 32, it's described as execution. But although as we read through these descriptions, there's some detail of the physical side, there's some indication as to the pain of the cross, Luke seems to stress far more the shame of the cross than the pain of the cross. Now, one man has helpfully described this whole scene as an anti-coronation. So all the things that you would do for a king who's being crowned, it's almost as if they're being twisted and the opposite is going on here. Let me give some examples. So when a king comes to his throne, there are cheering crowds. Here the crowds are mourning and wailing. The very opposite. Instead of being supported by members of his royal family, this king is placed between 2 criminals. Instead of choosing a wonderful location, this event takes place in the place of the skull. Instead of dressing him in a new robe, they gamble for his clothes. Instead of wonderful public proclamations, he's given a title out of mockery. Instead of speeches about the king's greatness, we get sneering and mockery and insults. It's almost as if, Luke is putting before you, yes, there was pain, but think about the shame. And this is what Jesus went through for you, for us. We need to know this. We need to be reminded, the eyewitness, first-hand accounts, the real thing. And I think in some way that might motivate us. We must stand up for the one who stood up to so much for us. We must surely stand up for the one who stood up to so much for us. So I think the first thing we are given here to kind of put steel in our bones is just the very facts of the crucifixion. What did Jesus suffer? Pain and shame for us. Isn't he worthy of our loyalty? But I think the other thing that kind of therefore comes through all of this is secondly, he's pointing us to the wonder of Jesus himself, the Christ. And as we look through this, and as particularly we think about the things that Jesus says and how he responds and so on, I think there's kind of three sides to Jesus that we see here. I think the first one we might say is this: he is the compassionate prophet. Notice that strange situation in verse 27. Many people come, they mourn and wail, and Jesus turns to them and says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, weep for yourselves and your children. For the time will come," etc., etc. "For if men do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Now, 40 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, in AD 70, the Romans finally had enough of the troublemakers in Jerusalem and almost completely destroyed the city, including its precious temple. And Jesus is probably alluding to this time. If they think things are bad now, he says, by comparison, something far more destructive to your state and your people is lying ahead. And he uses this simple illustration of the green tree and the dry tree. Think about it. If you burn a green tree, if you set fire to a green tree, the leaves might burn off, some of the branches might go, but the trunk will probably survive, and the fire will just peter out. Set fire to a dry, dead tree, and within a very short time, all you have is ashes. Jesus fears for this nation. He knows what awaits them. But there's no kind of gloating over their comeuppance. He's not saying, "Aha, I know what's going to happen to you." Rather, his understanding of the future is marked by compassion. Don't weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. Jesus is the compassionate prophet, even at this time of great horror. I think the other thing, again, which stands out is he is the forgiving sufferer. 32 and 33, two other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified him along with the criminals, one on the right, one on the left. How does Jesus respond? With anger, with revenge, with bitterness. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." He's the forgiving sufferer. And then, of course, in his response to that criminal, he's the saving Lord. It's amazing, even at this point with Jesus nailed on the cross, he's the most unlikely person in the world who looks as though he's about to start a kingdom. And yet, there's something about him which causes a hardened criminal to come to repentance and faith. We are receiving what we deserve. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus is the saving Lord with great assurance about this man's future. Today, you will be with me in paradise. Now, I don't know about you, but some of my friends spend a lot of their time complaining about people. When I have time with them, they complain about their bosses. They complain about their family. They complain about their friends. They complain about their families. Even sometimes they're honest enough to complain about themselves. And I think we're all a bit like that, aren't we? But when we put these things together about Jesus, we can have no complaints about him. Quite the opposite. His compassion is peerless. His knowledge, his understanding, his forgiveness, the promises of assurance that he can give. Surely all this and more will cure something of our cowardice and make us speak of Jesus with bolder confidence. Let's just move on. I think the third thing here and the final thing is what I'm going to refer to as the cosmos. Now, I'm using that word not simply just to refer to what happens with the sun, but also just to hint at the dimensions that seem to be suggested here. There's a kind of a degree to what's going on which is beyond simply what's happening here. There's a drama being played out. There's something momentous taking place. And we see that in verses 44 and following. It's now about the 6th hour, and darkness comes over the whole land until the 9th hour. For the sun stops shining. That's the kind of in the cosmos. But there's something great happening here. The curtain of the temple was torn in two. Jesus calls out with a loud voice, "Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit." And he breathes his last. And a centurion, seeing what happens, praises God and says, "Surely this was a righteous man." So it's as if Luke says, well, firstly, I want to take you to what goes on with the sun. Suddenly it goes dark. It's not an eclipse. This is taking place at Passover when there's a full moon, which means the moon's the other side of the earth from the sun. It's not an eclipse. It's a supernatural thing happening. And what does darkness mean? Darkness means judgment. God's judgment is being poured out, even on this Jesus in those 3 hours. And then Luke kind of takes us from the sun to the other side of Jerusalem, to the temple, where something else dramatic is taking place. One of the curtains that signifies our separation from God has just been torn in two, so that the purpose, the pattern of the temple is fulfilled and is now obsolete. Why? Because access to God has been made available through Jesus. God's judgment has opened the door to God's grace. And then Jesus cries out, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," and breathes his last. His work has been completed. Everything he came for has been finished. He can now happily commit himself into his Father's hands. And then to cap it all, a Gentile Roman soldier acknowledges the truth about Jesus, hinting, we might say, at the spread of the gospel to all nations. There's 4 very, very quickly fired, simple explanations about things that are going on, but it kind of takes that whole cross to a much bigger level. God's judgment is seen here, which is opening way for God's grace. Jesus is completing his saving work, and the gospel spreading out, starting here across the nations. Each of these things are packed, we might say, with kind of cosmic dimensions. They're full of wonder, and it's going to take the rest of the New Testament to unpack each of those things, and it's going to take the rest of history to see them worked out around the world. And what you and I have the opportunity to be a part of is this wonderful, amazing, glorious event outworking history. And surely it can cure our cowardice. It can give us bold confidence. And we can follow in the footsteps of Joseph of Arimathea and those women. We can follow in the footsteps even of Richard and Sabina Wurmbrand. And we can honour Jesus when others choose to ignore him. And when we feel timid, when we feel frightened, when we feel hesitant, something's being talked about amongst our friends at university or at college or in the workplace, and we know we should say something. We know we should say something, but we're fearful. And let's come back to the things that put steel in the bones of a man like Joseph of Arimathea, the things that put steel in the bones of people like Richard and Sabina Wurmbrand. Let's think about what Jesus did for us. Let's think about the kind of person he is. Let's think about the dimensions of all that he achieved, of what was going on that day.